The old rancher had seen his fair share of strange things in his lifetime, but nothing quite like this. There, standing in front of him under the fading light of day, was a Mustang, broken, bloodied, and limping slowly toward him as if it knew exactly who to trust. Its hooves scraped against the dirt, dragging its body toward the rancher's old barn. Well, what in tarnation? The rancher muttered to himself. He could hardly believe his eyes. Was it a wild horse? One of the Mustangs he'd seen grazing from time to time on the hills. But why was it here, and why in such a terrible condition? His heart skipped a beat when the Mustang, eyes wide with desperation, made a strange, almost human-like gesture. It stretched its neck towards him, and for a brief moment, their gazes locked. In that fleeting exchange, the rancher felt a pang of recognition, but the feeling was fleeting, buried deep beneath confusion and worry. How could an animal so wild, so untamed, seek help from him? And why had it come all this way, injured and vulnerable? Taking cautious steps forward, he felt a knot in his stomach. As he neared the animal, he could see the deep gashes on its legs, the rough, jagged cuts that were far too clean to have been made by just another wild animal. These wounds, they were deliberate. His old, weathered fingers reached out to touch the Mustang's flank. The animal shivered at the contact but did not pull away. There was an undeniable trust in its demeanor, but the rancher could feel a strange unease settle over him. Something wasn't right. As he began to inspect the injury more closely, he heard a faint rustling sound behind him, something like a whisper. He turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the quiet stretch of open field and the lonely rustling of the dry grass. The chill of the wind brushed across his skin, carrying with it an ominous stillness. The Mustang's legs buckled slightly, and it collapsed to its knees, groaning softly in pain. The rancher steadied himself, preparing to help, but the gnawing suspicion in the back of his mind refused to let go. Who would do this? He wondered. Why harm such a magnificent creature? He knew wild Mustangs were fiercely protected by law, but even that knowledge didn't answer the question of who could have been so cruel. He bent down, looking at the Mustang's eyes once again. It looked at him with a mixture of pain and pleading, as if to say, "Save me, before it's too late." The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Something was out of place here, he could feel it in his bones. And as the rancher tried to lift the Mustang's head, his gaze shifted towards the horizon. In the far distance, barely visible, he noticed a figure, just a dark shape, standing still in the middle of the field. It was too far away to make out details, but the figure didn't seem to move. He squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure remained just outside the range of his vision. It was enough to send a shiver down his spine. "Who's there?" he muttered under his breath, but no one answered. The wind picked up, whipping around him, making the trees groan and sway. The rancher slowly turned his attention back to the Mustang, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. There was a story behind this injury, a story he was just beginning to scratch the surface of. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the knot that refused to loosen. Something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. "Stay with me, old girl," he whispered to the Mustang, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't leave you." But deep down, he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. Not when there was someone, or something, out there watching, waiting. The Mustang let out a quiet, almost mournful whinny, as if it, too, knew that time was running out. The rancher carefully adjusted the Mustang's head, making sure it was as comfortable as possible on the ground. His hands shook slightly as he pressed his fingers against the horse's ribs, feeling for broken bones or any deeper injuries. There was a quiet intensity in his movements. He had done this many times before with animals that were injured, but this felt different. It wasn't just the Mustang's physical wounds that unsettled him, it was the way the animal looked at him, with a deep, knowing gaze that sent a shiver down his spine. He gently whispered to the Mustang as he worked, trying to reassure it, but his mind was elsewhere. It wandered back to his own past, to a time when he had been far younger, still full of hope and life. Back then, he had his own wild horse, a strong stallion named Echo. It had been his companion for years, through thick and thin, always by his side. The two of them had shared everything, and no bond could compare to the one they had. But one winter, a cruel twist of fate had struck. Echo had fallen into a ravine, breaking its leg so badly that it was beyond repair. The memory of that day still haunted him, like a ghost that refused to leave. The pain of losing Echo had been unbearable, and though he had tried to move on, that empty space in his heart had never truly healed. He had stopped riding for a long time, letting his barn grow dusty and unused. The horses he had kept after Echo were good animals, but none of them had ever filled that void. He remembered the vet who had come to examine Echo, shaking his head in sorrow as he gave the final verdict. "There's nothing we can do," the vet had said. "You'll have to make the call." The rancher had never forgotten those words. He had stood there, looking down at his beloved horse, and for a moment, time had stopped. He hadn't known how to say goodbye. "Not this time," he muttered softly to himself as he knelt by the injured Mustang. He wasn't about to lose another horse, not like this. The Mustang gave a soft nicker, as though it could sense the rancher's deep sorrow. For a brief moment, their gazes met again, and the rancher felt the same bond he had once felt with Echo. It was as if the Mustang had come to him in a time of need, calling out for help just like he had years ago when he needed someone to help Echo. But this was different. This time, the rancher wasn't just dealing with a hurt animal. He was dealing with something that had a deeper meaning, something that reached into his soul and threatened to unearth old wounds he had spent years trying to bury. His mind wandered back to the strange figure he had seen in the distance earlier. Who was that? Why had they been watching him so intently? The rancher couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for him to make a mistake, to slip up somehow. But this time, the rancher wasn't going to back down. He had learned the hard way that in times of danger, you couldn't afford to hesitate. He had lost too much already, too many people, too many animals, to let fear take control. The rancher continued to tend to the Mustang, carefully cleaning the wound on its leg, but every so often, he would glance toward the horizon. That figure was still there, hidden in the distance, but it never moved. The tension in the air was thick, too thick to ignore. Whoever they weren't going to leave him alone. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, the rancher began to feel a gnawing unease in the pit of his stomach. He had been alone for years, but he was starting to realize that being alone didn't mean he was safe. The world, it seemed, was full of dangers, hidden dangers that had a way of creeping up on you when you least expected them. And now, it appeared that the Mustang had brought some of those dangers with it. The rancher took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We're in this together now," he whispered to the Mustang. "I'll make sure no one hurts you. Not while I'm still breathing." As the last light of day faded, the rancher stood up, wiping his hands on his old work pants. He glanced once more at the distant figure, still there, still watching, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. This was no ordinary animal, and this was no ordinary night. Something was coming. And whatever it was not something the rancher had ever faced before. The rancher couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't just a passing unease, it was a gut instinct, one that had served him well in his years as a rancher. He had learned long ago to trust his senses, and right now, they were screaming at him to be cautious. He looked down at the Mustang again, who seemed to sense his anxiety, its deep brown eyes reflecting the same unease. The animal was still breathing heavily, its body trembling from the pain, but it seemed to be gathering its strength as if it knew something the rancher didn't. "Hold on, old girl," he murmured as he carefully examined the injury on the Mustang's leg again. The wound was worse than it had seemed at first. The cuts were deep, the kind of injury that no wild animal could have inflicted on its own. The rancher's mind kept returning to the unnatural way the wounds looked, as if the horse had been deliberately harmed, and not by a predator, but by a human hand. As he worked, the rancher's gaze kept drifting back to the horizon, where the dark figure had once stood. Whoever it was, they hadn't moved, and that in itself was unsettling. People didn't linger out there, not unless they had a reason to. A sharp rustling from the nearby trees snapped him out of his thoughts, and he immediately stood up, his body tensing. The sound came again, this time closer. He took a few steps toward the source, his boots crunching on the dry earth beneath him. It was getting darker by the minute, and the wind had picked up, rustling the dry leaves on the ground. "Is someone out there?" the rancher called into the emptiness, his voice firm but laced with suspicion. No response. He gripped the shovel he had been using to dig a small trench around the barn and stepped closer to the trees. As he reached the edge of the forest, he stopped, his eyes narrowing. In the dim light, he could make out something, a shadow moving between the trees. It was too far away to distinguish clearly, but the unmistakable shape of a figure was there, hidden in the darkness. The rancher's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. He knew what it felt like to be hunted, to be outnumbered. He wasn't about to walk into another ambush, especially not while protecting the Mustang. He glanced back at the horse, who was struggling to stand again, its hooves scraping the earth weakly. "Stay here," the rancher ordered in a low voice, though he knew the animal couldn't understand. He cautiously moved deeper into the woods, keeping to the shadows and staying as quiet as possible. The faint rustling continued, but it was too erratic to track, almost like whoever was out there was trying to draw him in. As he made his way through the trees, his mind raced. What was going on? The Mustang had come to him for help, but why had it been hurt so badly? And who was the figure in the woods? Was it someone who needed help too, or was it someone dangerous? His thoughts were interrupted by a low, guttural sound, a whisper that sent chills down his spine. Someone, or something, was definitely there. Suddenly, a movement to his left caught his eye. He turned quickly, only to find that he was now facing what looked like a small campfire. Someone had set up camp in the middle of the woods, strangely close to his ranch. The rancher's heart raced as he scanned the area, his hand tightening around the shovel. That's when he saw it, the thing that made his blood run cold. Scattered on the ground near the campfire were old, tattered pages, some of them yellowed with age. The rancher crouched down, his heart pounding as he picked up one of the pages. It was a journal, old and worn, the handwriting barely legible. The words he could make out made his stomach tighten. "Wild Mustangs, profit to be made, if they can be captured alive." The journal's entries were dated back decades, written by someone who had clearly been obsessed with capturing the wild horses. But why had it been left here, in the woods so close to his farm? And why had the Mustang, seemingly knowing its fate, come to him for help? The rancher's thoughts whirled as he stood up, clenching the journal in his hand. He didn't know what he was dealing with, but he was starting to understand the gravity of the situation. The Mustang's injury wasn't random, it was part of something much bigger. And the figure in the woods? They weren't here to help. They were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sudden realization hit him like a ton of bricks: someone was after that Mustang, someone willing to do anything to capture it. A cold wind blew through the trees, and the rancher knew one thing for sure. He had to act fast, or the Mustang would be gone forever. He turned on his heel, heading back toward the ranch, heart pounding in his chest. The Mustang's fate, and his own, were now entwined in a dangerous game, one that neither of them could afford to lose. The rancher rushed back to the barn, his thoughts in overdrive. The journal had only confirmed what he had feared: the wild Mustangs were being targeted by poachers. The sinister conspiracy wasn't just about stealing horses for sport or profit, it was about something deeper, something darker. The Mustangs weren't just being captured, they were being hunted down by those who understood the power these creatures held. His boots thudded against the ground as he made his way back to the Mustang, who was still resting by the barn, its breathing shallow but steady. It seemed to have calmed slightly, but the pain from its injuries had not relented. The rancher stood over the animal, placing a hand on its mane, feeling the heat radiating from its body. "Don't worry," he murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. "I won't let them take you." But he knew that wasn't enough. The poachers weren't just out there, they were closer than he realized. The rancher's heart raced, his mind working furiously to connect the dots. The figure in the woods, the journal with its cryptic entries, the sense of being watched, it all pointed toward a larger, far more organized effort to hunt and capture the wild mustangs. The rancher had lived in this part of the country long enough to know when things didn't add up. And right now, everything was adding up to a dangerous truth. He had to protect the Mustang at all costs. If it wasn't just one person watching him but a whole group of poachers, there was no telling what they were capable of. They wouldn't hesitate to hurt him to get what they wanted. The rancher took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had faced down worse odds in his lifetime, but this felt different, there was something personal about it. He moved quickly to secure the barn, locking the doors and barring all windows with whatever he could find. The Mustang needed a place to heal, and it needed to be safe. He couldn't afford to have it in the open where it might be captured. But as he worked, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. The rancher couldn't shake the thought that the poachers already knew exactly where he was. Before he could finish securing the barn, the wind kicked up again, whistling through the trees in a low, eerie moan. The rancher paused, listening intently. The woods seemed too quiet now, too still. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, this time, much closer. The rancher's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the silhouette. It was the same figure he had seen earlier, the one who had been watching from afar. Only now, they were walking directly toward him, their steps purposeful and confident. He couldn't waste any more time. The poachers were here, and they were coming for the Mustang. The rancher grabbed his rifle, a trusted companion he'd kept for years, and crept out of the barn, keeping low to the ground. The figure had stopped, standing just outside the barn's perimeter, watching the rancher. There was no more mistaking it. This was no casual trespasser. The rancher's mind raced as he observed the figure's movements. Was this the same person from the journal? It didn't matter. Whoever they were part of something much larger. The rancher knew he had to stop them before they got any closer. He stepped cautiously toward the figure, keeping to the shadows as he approached. The figure was tall, cloaked in dark clothing, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The rancher's breath hitched as he watched the figure pull something from their coat, a small, sleek device that looked like a tracker. His heart sank. The poachers had been tracking the Mustang all along. As the figure placed the device on the ground, the rancher's grip tightened on the rifle. He wasn't going to let them have the horse. Not after everything they had been through. But just as he was about to make his move, the figure turned, revealing something that made the rancher freeze in place. The figure was no stranger. The rancher's blood ran cold as the face became visible, an old acquaintance, someone he had known from years ago. "John?" the rancher asked, his voice barely above a whisper, disbelief thick in his tone. The figure paused, then slowly nodded, a grim smile crossing his face. "Didn't expect to see you here, old friend." The rancher's heart slammed against his chest. John had been a trusted ally years ago, someone who had worked on the ranch with him before disappearing. Now, here he was, part of a network of criminals, working with the poachers. "You're the one behind this?" the rancher demanded, his voice shaking with anger. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply looked back toward the barn, where the Mustang was hidden. "This isn't personal," John finally said, his tone cold. "It's business. You should have stayed out of it. You should have let the horse go. But now, well, now it's too late." A surge of anger flooded the rancher's veins. John had been his friend, and now, he was the enemy. The rancher's grip tightened on his rifle. He wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Before he could act, a faint sound in the distance caught his attention, another figure, moving quickly toward them, followed by more rustling sounds. The rancher's blood ran cold. The poachers were closing in, and they were not alone. The rancher's heart raced as he stood frozen in place, the weight of his rifle heavy in his hands. John, the man he once called a friend, was now standing before him as one of the poachers, with no remorse in his eyes, just cold calculation. The Mustang, now a pawn in a dangerous game, was counting on him to act. "John," the rancher said, trying to keep his voice steady, "you don't have to do this. We can still walk away, you and me. Let the horse go, and maybe we can forget this ever happened." John's eyes hardened, and he shook his head slowly. "You don't understand, do you? This is bigger than you, bigger than the Mustang. You've been living in a dream. But I've seen the real world. This is the way it works now." The rancher clenched his jaw. This wasn't the man he once knew. The John he had worked beside years ago had been someone full of life, full of good intentions, not a man who sold out his soul for profit. A sharp sound in the distance broke the silence, a loud crack followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. More poachers were coming, and it sounded like they were closing in fast. The rancher's grip tightened on his rifle. He couldn't just stand there and wait for them to come to him. If he didn't act now, it would be too late. "Stay back," he said to John, voice hard. "You've got one chance to turn around. Leave. Now." John's lips curled into a sneer. "You're wasting your time. You can't stop this. You should have stayed out of this. You should have kept to your little farm." The rancher didn't wait for him to finish. He darted forward, aiming to tackle John before he could react. But in the split second it took him to move, John spun and fired a shot into the air, a warning shot meant to keep him back. The rancher hesitated for a moment, the sound of the gunshot ringing in his ears, before pressing forward. There was no choice now. His mind was clear. He had one goal: protect the Mustang. With a burst of strength, the rancher lunged, knocking John to the ground. The two struggled, rolling in the dirt, each one fighting to get the upper hand. John's hands grasped for the rifle, but the rancher was faster, pulling it out of his grasp and tossing it aside. For a moment, everything was chaos, grappling in the dust, struggling to subdue one another. But the rancher's resolve never wavered. He had to keep going. He couldn't let John, or the poachers, win. A voice rang out from behind him, sharp and commanding. "Hold it right there." The rancher turned just in time to see two other figures, dark silhouettes against the fading light, coming toward him with guns raised. The poachers were now here in full force. They outnumbered him, he had no chance unless he made a stand. His heart pounded as he stared down the new threats. His thoughts flashed to the Mustang, who was still back at the barn, vulnerable, exposed. The rancher's breath quickened. There was no time left. He had to protect that animal, no matter what the cost. He quickly scanned his surroundings, looking for anything that could help him. To his right, a large, weathered crate lay against the barn wall. Without thinking, he dove toward it, knocking it over and grabbing what he needed, tools and spare planks of wood. He swung one of the planks at the approaching poachers, knocking one of them off balance. The other poacher raised his gun, but the rancher was faster. He sprinted toward him, using the plank to block the shot, before disarming the man with a swift, forceful strike. The gun fell to the ground, and the rancher grabbed it, aiming it at the remaining poachers. He wasn't sure what he was doing, whether he was making the right choice, but he knew there was no turning back. "Get out of here," he shouted, voice raw with fury. "This ends now. Leave." Or you won't be walking out of here." The poachers hesitated for just a moment, uncertainty flickering across their faces. But then, with a grunt of frustration, one of them turned and bolted toward the woods. The other followed, disappearing into the shadows. The rancher stood there, panting heavily, his heart still racing as the tension began to release. He had done it. He had stopped them, at least for now. But just as he was about to exhale, something caught his eye. John, the man he had once trusted, was getting up from the ground. Bloodied and bruised, but still alive. He glared at the rancher, his expression filled with hatred. "This isn't over," John muttered, his voice low and dangerous. The rancher didn't flinch. He simply watched as John disappeared into the darkening woods, knowing full well this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. But for now, he had won. The Mustang was safe. He turned back to the barn, his muscles aching, but a strange sense of relief flooding his chest. It was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the world lighten, if only for a moment. The rancher walked back to the barn, his movements slow but deliberate, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His hands were still trembling, and the rifle in his grip felt heavier than ever. He paused at the barn door, taking in a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. There was a silence in the air now, the kind that only comes after a storm has passed. The poachers were gone, at least for the time being, but he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Inside the barn, the Mustang was still lying on the ground, its breathing steady but shallow. The rancher's heart clenched as he approached, kneeling beside the animal. The Mustang's dark eyes met his, and for a moment, they simply stared at one another. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged in the heat of the moment. The rancher had protected this animal, fought for it, and now it was up to him to make sure it recovered, to heal the wounds that went deeper than flesh. He gently stroked the Mustang's mane, his hands soft and comforting. "You made it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're safe now." But the reality of the situation was never far from his mind. The poachers might return. John might return. The rancher knew that the battle wasn't over, it would continue until the last of the Mustangs were free from those who wanted to exploit them. The world was full of darkness, of people who would do anything for money, power, or control. But there was light too, there was love, there was compassion, and there was hope. And that, the rancher realized, was something worth fighting for. As the hours passed, the Mustang slowly regained its strength. The rancher stayed by its side, tending to its wounds and speaking to it in soft tones, as if his words alone could heal the pain. In the quiet of the barn, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It wasn't just the Mustang he was saving, it was a piece of himself. The same piece of him that had died with Echo, the same part of him that had been lost along the way. But now, with the Mustang at his side, he felt that old bond stirring once again. It wasn't just about protecting the horses anymore. It was about redemption. It was about making things right, not just for the animals, but for himself. The rancher had been running from his past for too long, hiding behind his farm and his solitude. But this was his chance to make a difference, to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the barn's cracks, the rancher stood at the doorway, looking out over the land. The Mustang was up now, its legs still unsteady but stronger than the day before. There was something deeply satisfying in watching it take its first few steps toward the open field. The rancher smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. But then, as the sun broke over the horizon, a thought crossed his mind. He had been given a second chance. And with that chance came a responsibility. The Mustang would go back to the wild, back to where it belonged. But there were others, so many others, who needed help, who needed someone to fight for them. The rancher turned back to the barn, where the Mustang was grazing quietly in the corner. It was time to let it go, to let it return to its freedom. He didn't want to lose the bond they had formed over the past few days, but he knew it was the right thing to do. The Mustang looked back at him, its gaze calm and unwavering. It seemed to understand. The rancher slowly opened the barn door, stepping aside as the Mustang trotted out into the open fields, its powerful legs carrying it with ease. He watched it for a moment, feeling a surge of emotion welling up in his chest. It wasn't the end for the Mustang, it was the beginning of something new. And it wasn't the end for him either. It was the start of a new purpose. As the Mustang disappeared into the distance, the rancher stood there, watching it disappear into the wild, feeling a sense of peace settle in his heart. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he had done what he could, he had made a stand. And now, as the sun rose higher in the sky, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. The world was full of danger, yes. But it was also full of beauty, of love, of hope. And in that moment, as he watched the Mustang run free, the rancher knew one thing for sure: sometimes, the greatest fight of all was simply to believe in what was right, even when everything around you told you to give up. Life lesson: the rancher's journey wasn't just about saving a Mustang, it was about rediscovering his own strength, his own purpose. The true battle in life isn't always against others. Sometimes, it's about fighting for what's worth protecting, no matter the odds. Courage, compassion, and the willingness to stand up for what's right can change the course of our lives and the lives of those around us. And that's a fight worth taking on.